Welcome Professor Pilshchikov to NYU, to the Slavic Department, and to the Jordan Center, who will talk to us about two vibrant subdisciplines within our field simultaneously, one of which is the study of Russian formalism, which is, judging by current dissertations and events that have been happening in the past months, making a thunderous comeback into Russian field in the States, and of course digital humanities, which are everywhere. Professor Pilshchikov is lead researcher at the Institute of Russian Culture, of World Culture at Moscow State University, and senior researcher at Tallinn University. He is author of Batyushkov and Italian Literature from 2003 in Russian, and together with Igor Pilshchikov, Vocabulary and Phraseology of Eugene Onegin. He has also published numerous articles on Russian literature, comparative literature, editorial theory, literary theory, verse theory, history of Russian poetic language, cultural semiotics, and digital humanities. Professor Pilshchikov is the founding editor-in-chief of the Fundamental Digital Library of Russian Literature and Folklore, feb-web.ru. Those of you who are interested, very extremely useful resource, and of Russian Virtual Library as well. He is former editor-in-chief of a am I echoing to myself? No. He is former editor-in-chief of the bilingual Journal of Russian and Theoretical Philology, Philologica, and co-editor currently of the biannual Journal of Prosody and Poetics, Studia Metrica et Philologica. So I give you Professor Pilshchikov, who will speak to us on the legacy of Russian formalism and contemporary humanities.
Thank you for your introduction. The theory of literature and poetic language, developed by the Russian formalists in the late 1910s and 1920s, revolutionized the 20th century humanities. And the importance of the Russian formal school is hard to overestimate. However, only the Petrograd Association of the Formalists, the Society for the Study of Poetic Language, POYAZ, is usually discussed in this context with its hardcore members Viktor Shklovsky, Boris Eichenbaum, and Yuri Tynyanov, as well as Osip Brik and Roman Jakobson. René Welek expressed this common vision when he stated that it was a POYAZ rather than any other group that became the nucleus of the Russian formalist movement. The intellectual and organizational center of Moscow formalism, the Moscow Linguistic Circle, MLC, MLK, is hardly mentioned even in essential studies. Unfortunately, the impact of the MLK on the contemporary development of literary and linguistic studies remains underestimated. The discussion is still going on if Moscow formalism existed indeed. However different the two branches of formalism were, they both so this is about POYAZ. They both share a few basic ideas. So the first idea is the opposition of poetic and everyday language, or practical language. The second idea is that the former is defined as the deformation of the latter. This is what Jakobson called violence over language. The third idea is best formulated in Viktor Shklovsky's groundbreaking essay of 1917, Art as a Device. In art, how and for what purpose are more important than what and for what reason. I think that only two formalists found this delineation unnecessary. It was Boris Yerho and Viktor Zhermunsky, who is at the same time was not a proper formalist because he was called eclectic by Jakobson and Tynyanov. The fourth important idea common for almost all formalisms is the study of literature as an autonomous discipline, specification of the object of literary studies, as Boris Tomaszewski put it in 1928, or the study of literariness, that is what makes a given work a work of art, as Roman Jakobson coined it in 1921. To these fundamental postulates, we should add the idea of the close interaction of linguistic and literary scholarship, and last but not least, the desire to make the study of literature an exact science. So the following are a few distinctive ideas which may be associated with individual scholars. Viktor Shklovsky, the idea which laid the foundation for the poetics of prose, the position of fabula, the story as material, and sujet, the plot as construction, and as well as his most well-known idea of the device of остранение, defamiliarization, which removes the automatism of perception. Another important Upper Yaz member, Boris Eichenbaum, is famous for his article How Gogol's Overcoat is Made of 1919, which compares the problem of sujet with the problem of skaz, as he himself formulated in 1925. The use of the concept of skaz, the change of verbal masks, as the construction principle of the plotless short story is important, because if Shklovsky focused his attention to the correlation between a fabula and sujet, the plotless story from Gogol to early Tolstoy and to other writers, when applied to the history of literature, enables us to identify the importance of skaz in early Tolstoy and in influence on the composition of his later works, as well as the skaz tradition in Russian prose, from Gogol to Leskov and from Leskov to Remizov. Not less important are the ideas which were discussed in Eichenbaum's book The Melodics of Russian Lyrical Verse of 1922, the idea of intonation as an interrelation between syntactic and poetic segmentations. In Moscow, similar ideas were developed by Osip Brik, whom Eichenbaum cites at the very beginning of his book, in the very first footnote to the Melodics. Yuri Tynyanov, Yuri Tynyanov, one of the most fruitful ideas of his was the distinction between evolution and genesis, as expressed in his works from 1920 to 1927. For Tynyanov, evolution is intrinsic to the literary series, Ryad, or national tradition, whereas genesis is extrinsic. It implies an interaction between literature and other social and cultural practices, or between one national tradition and another. And now we can add that between one national tradition and another national tradition which belong to two different traditions. So the intertextual relations can be also interpreted in terms of Tynyanov's genesis rather than Tynyanov's evolution. So it's I pointed out the fact that the problems of evolution and genesis were expressed and developed in the works of Tynyanov from the early 1920s. And it's hard to agree with the historian of Russian and Polish formalism, Andrzej Karch, who claims that, to quote, formalism introduces the notion of literary evolution and renewal and the dynamism of literary form only in its later phase under Stalinist pressures. We can see that the concept of literary evolution emerges in formalist works long before the Great Turn of 1929 and was supported by Boris Eichenbaum in the second half of the 1920s. His first book on Tolstoy, with its attention to literaturny byt, the problem of interaction between literature and literary everyday life, which are supposed to be the closest social series or order. It's dated 1928, and Eichenbaum supported this idea later than Tynyanov. According to Tynyanov, evolution is nomothetical, while genesis is accidental. The next stage in the development of this concept was Jakobson and Tynyanov's joint venture, Problems in the Study of Literature and Language, which were published in 1928 in Novy Lev and marked the transition from formalism to structuralism or proto-structuralism. The study of literature as an autonomous series should be complemented thereby with a complex study of other related series, ridi, the sum total of which, that is culture, should be considered as a systematically and hierarchically organized whole, that is structure. To quote, "At the present time, the achievements of the synchronic concept force us to reconsider the principles of diachrony as well. The idea of a mechanical agglomeration of material, having been replaced by the concept of a system or structure in the realm of synchronic study, underwent a corresponding replacement in the realm of diachronic study as well. The history of a system is in turn a system. Pure synchronism now proves to be an illusion. Every synchronic system has its past and its future as inseparable structural elements of the system." This self-delineation was transferred into the first manifesto of structuralism. This term was coined in 1929 by Jakobson in a newspaper note to the First International Congress of Slavists. He wrote it in Czech and much later, in 1971, reproduced this in English in the retrospect to the second volume of his selected writings. I quote, "Were we to comprise the leading idea of present-day science in its most various manifestations, we could hardly find a more appropriate designation than structuralism. Any set of phenomena examined by contemporary science is treated not as a mechanical agglomeration but as a structural whole, and the basic task is to reveal the inner, whether static or developmental, laws of the system. It follows from this that genesis is also nomothetical, and therefore the most significant post-Tynyanov methodological step is identification of an evolutionary development in the changes of different genetic forms. That is the evolution of genesis, including the evolution of intertextual forms. If every system necessarily exists as evolution, whereas on the other hand evolution is inescapably of a systemic nature, as Jakobson and Tynyanov claim, then this also applies to the evolution of a system of systems, as Jakobson and Tynyanov call it. That is the evolution of the system of correlations between the series, and it is one of the topical questions in the sphere of literary history, which can include both the story of text, the history of its creations, and the history of intertextual relations between texts. So the second important set of ideas are the ideas which were discussed in Tynyanov's book, The Problem of Poetic Language of 1924, the unity and density of the poetic series, or the concept that the common language semantics may be transformed, or as Tynyanov put it, deformed by the specific relations imposed by verse segmentation. Grigory Vinokur wrote to Tynyanov in a private letter that to transform is a better verb for to describe what Tynyanov is describing in his book, and Tynyanov agreed that it may be better than deform, but we know Tynyanov's concept as the concept of deformation. So, the activities of the Moscow Linguistic Circle coincide chronologically with those of Apayaz. Apayaz started to function officially in 1916, although Shklovsky's first programmatic statement, Resurrection of the Word, was published as early as 1914 and dissolved after 1923. MLK was established in 1915. The statute was ready in 1914 and functioned until 1924. Maxim Shapir, one of the main partisans of the traditions of the MLC, opposed the Moscow Linguistic Circle to Apayaz. He wrote that the contribution of the Moscow Linguistic Circle to the linguistics and poetics of the 20th century, both Russian and worldwide, cannot be compared to any other. However, in the absence of its own journals and publishing houses, plus the lack of any avant-gardist self-advertisement in the organization of the everyday intellectual life of Moscow scholars, led to the Petrograd Apayaz becoming the symbol of Russian formalism, whereas the fundamental work of the creation of the new philology was going on in the MLC. The role that the circle played in the fields of linguistic poetics verse studies, statistical methods in the humanities, semiotics and philosophy of art has not been investigated properly because the proceedings of the MLC still await publication. And now I'm working together with my colleagues on the digital and printed publication of the proceedings of the MLC. I just wanted to point out the fact that the proceedings of the Prague Linguistic Circle, which was a much more published organizational unit, which was pointed out by Kapson and Vyacheslav Ivanov. They compared PLC and the Payaz and opposed it to the MLC, which remained in archives. I hope that well, the proceedings of the PLC were published only 3 years ago in 2012. So we hope to do the same with the MLC proceedings now. So among the unpublished materials of the MLC, the most important place should be ascribed to the reports and menus from the meetings of the Circle, which are now kept at the Vinogradov Institute of Russian Language in Moscow. It's about 700 pages. Another important group of materials includes unpublished papers on general philology, linguistic poetics and verse theory written by the members of the phenomenological wing of the Circle, first and foremost Maxim Konigsberg, whose works are preserved in Moscow archives. So the main object of studies in the MLC were linguistics, poetics, metrics and folklore. This is from the statute of the Circle, which was confirmed by Alexei Shakhmatov, the president of the Division of Languages and Literature of the Academy of Sciences. The first president of the Circle was Roman Kapson, and he held this office until he left Russia in January 1920. He was followed by the linguist Mikhail Peterson, Alexei Buslaev, Grigory Vinokur and Nikolai Yakovlev. Among the co-founders, but not presidents of the MLC, was the folklorist Pyotr Bogatyrev. The Circle members worked in a wide variety of fields. However, the MLC's strongest side was the ability to look at the old things in a new way. As Buslaev said at the anniversary of the MLC on the 29th of February 1920, the main task of the Circle was a methodological revolution. If Payaz, as Eichenbaum put it, represented journalistic, that is anti-academic but not dilettantish criticism, then MLC represented academic scholarship. It was founded by Moscow University students, functioned under the auspices of the Moscow Dialectological Commission associated with the Imperial Academy of Sciences, and its statute was, as I said, approved by Alexei Shakhmatov, the head of the section of Russian Language and Literature of the Academy of Sciences. Among the full members of the Circle we find the theorist of verse Sergei Bobrov and Boris Tomaszewski, the leftist critic Osip Brik, the medievalist Boris Yerho, the philologist and verse theorist Maxim Konigsberg, the psycholinguist Nikolai Zhinkin, the folklorists Pyotr Bogatyrev and Yuri Sokolov, the theorist of literature Rosalia Shor, the philosopher Gustav Speth and other prominent scholars. Kapson, Brik and the textologist and poetry scholar Boris Tomaszewski were active participants in both Opayaz and MLC. It is not widely known that from 1918 to 1921 Tomaszewski lived and worked in Moscow. We got used to the idea that Tomaszewski is a typical Petersburg scholar. Roman Kapson, an ex-member of Opayaz and the first president of the MLC, emigrated to Czechoslovakia and became a co-founder of the Prague Linguistic Circle in 1926. Hence, formalism and its new incarnation, structuralism, started to spread over Europe and America after Kapson's emigration to the USA. In 1965, Kapson published an article titled An Example of Migratory Terms and Institutional Models with the subtitle on the 50th anniversary of the Moscow Linguistic Circle. Here he pointed out the fact that MLC served as an institutional model for both PLC and another important Central European structuralism, the Linguistic Circle of Copenhagen. Both circles were even named as to recall their Moscow predecessor. An important feature of PLC, however, was a combination of the MLC type organizational structure with regular meetings and the Opayaz type self-promotion based on the Circle's periodical Travaux de Cercle Linguistique de Prague, published from 1929 to 1939. Jacobson developed these ideas in his article on MLC, which was written in the 1970s for the Concise Literary Encyclopedia, Краткая литературная энциклопедия, but remained unpublished until 1996 when it appeared in the journal Philologica with Shapiro's introduction and notes. Here Jacobson wrote, to quote, "In 1926, the organizational model of MLC together with the research program and achievements laid the basis for the newly founded Prague Linguistic Circle, which significantly advanced and developed the work of its predecessor, with which it was connected via several common members. Some of them were permanent members of PLC, others were short-term visitors. Intensive publication activity and close personal contact with the international academic community contributed to the far-reaching dissemination and exchange of fruitful ideas in linguistics, poetics, and related disciplines. In particular, the legacy of the Moscow initiators is found in numerous linguistic circles that emerged in the various countries and adapted, following the Prague example, the name, the internal structure, and many plans and ideas which were characteristic of the MLC." Jacobson's articles on MLC confirmed the idea of another MLC member, Boris Gornung, that while for the Petrograd formalists, poetics was based on the theory of literature, for the Moscow formalists it was based on linguistics. Numerous communications and debates in the Moscow Linguistic Circle, Jacobson writes, attempted to elaborate new methods of linguistic analysis with particular reference to the diverse functions of language and especially to its poetic function. End of quote. As well as the Petrograd formalists, the Moscovites were convinced that, I quote, "the analysis of art is the analysis of forms of expression, of verbal forms." This quotation is taken not from Jacobson, but from Maxim Konigsberg. Konigsberg was one of the most gifted MLC scholars who died prematurely at the age of 24. Speth and Vinocourt both dedicated books to his memory. In the early 1920s, some of the young MLC members, including Konigsberg, Nikolai Zhinkin, Buslaev, Boris Gornung, were followers of Gustav Speth, the main proponent of Husserl's ideas in Russia. In contrast to the empirical positivists, who dominated the MLC in 1990 and 1920, the phenomenologists wanted to build a system of poetics based not on phonology, but on semasiology, because they considered language a semiotic phenomenon par excellence. The empirical positivists, first and foremost Jacobson and Yerho, conceived of poetics as part of linguistics, while the phenomenologists, first and foremost Speth and Konigsberg, regarded poetics as part of semiotics. Konigsberg developed this idea in the article The Concept of Philology and Poetics, Idea Philologii и Poetica, of 1924, which still remains unpublished. I hope to publish it this year or next year. After the closure of OPAYAS and MLC, the activities of their members continued in two colleges. One was the State Institute of the History of Arts, Государственный институт истории искусств in Petrograd, Leningrad, where Tynyanov and Eichenbaum conducted their seminar. The other was the State Academy of Artistic Sciences, Государственная академия художественных наук, Gachin, in Moscow, where Speth was vice president and Yerho was head of department. Many Gachin polemics can be traced back to the MLC debates. The disciples of Tynyanov and Eichenbaum at the Institute of the History of Arts, Lydia Ginsburg and Boris Buchstab, among others, are known under the label of junior formalists, Mlada Formalisty. Both institutions were closed after 1930, at the same time when formalism was officially banned. I would like to give special attention to Boris Yerho. Of Yerho's works, Methodologia точного литературоведения is of primary importance. The title can be translated as The Methodology of Exact Literary Studies or Exact Methods in Literary Studies. This opus magnum was written in 1935, finished in 1936, and then he wrote an addendum in 1937. But it remained unpublished in author's lifetime. In 1969, Mikhail Gasparov published the article Yerho's Works on the Theory of Literature and a synopsis of Yerho's methodology in the fourth volume of the Tartu Semiotic journal, Science Systems Studies. Only the last decade, the methodology was published in its entirety with an extensive commentary by Marina Akimova, your humble servant, and Maxim Shapir. This book came out in April 2006. It was devoted to the memory of Gasparov, who died in 2005, and turned out to be a monumentum in memoriam of Shapir, who died in the age of 44 in August 2006. As Gasparov noticed, Yerho's main contribution to philology was a large-scale plan which aimed at the development of the methodology of literary studies and the study of poetic language using statistical methods. Yerho followed closely the, also these are publications, the application of statistics in biology. He wrote, although biology cannot be considered an exact science to the same extent as mathematically based sciences, but as compared to the study of literature, it possesses such a high level of precision and demonstrativeness, which is desirable and a pursuable goal. Therefore, if I speak of an exact study of literature, I mean the same as Johansen, who entitled his book Elementen der exakten Ehrlichkeitslehre. Here Yerho mentions an eminent Danish botanist, Wilhelm Johansen, who developed the methods of biostatistics for the study of genetic variability. By the way, in this very book, published in 1909, Johansen introduced the term gene. It's interesting to note that a record, genre как ген, genre as a gene, is found in one of Tynianov's notebooks. Yerho wanted to advance literary studies with the same as Johansen did for biology, but in the methodology he compared himself with an even greater scholar. When I use quantitative calculation and microanalysis as the basis for research, I only propose to do for literature the same as Lavoisier did for chemistry some 150 years ago, and there is no doubt that the results will not be long in coming. The self-comparison with the greatest 18th century chemist Antoine Laurent de Lavoisier is a late echo of the earlier polemics between the formalists and the Marxists. Leon Trotsky, in his openly negative article, The Formal School in the Study of Poetry and Marxism, published in 1923 in the newspaper Pravda and in the same year included in his book Literature and Revolution, began his article with a compliment. The formal school is the first scientific school in arts. By Shklovsky's efforts, the theory of art developed from the state of alchemy to the state of chemistry. In the same article, Trotsky called Shklovsky the herald of the formal school, the first chemist in arts. Thus Yerho intended to make the next step after Opayaz and make the study of literature a genuine science. The main foundations of Yerho's methodology are as follows. The first idea. Literature should be regarded as a phenomenon per se and not as a manifestation of extra-literary phenomena such as social relations as in Marxism or physical complexes as in Freudianism. The second idea is that literature should be studied using the methods of natural sciences. Unlike all other Petrograd or Moscow formalists, Yerho insisted on the total quantification of philological knowledge. The third idea is that the aesthetic efficiency of any element at any level of the artistic work is determined by its quantitative or structural peculiarity. For Opayaz, structural peculiarity was more important, for Yerho both. The idea of the three levels or ambits of poetic forms, phonics, sound forms, verse and euphony, stylistics, language forms, and ideology or iconology or poetics, which includes conceptual and emotional forms, as well as imagery, motives and plots. The fourth ambit of form composition is, for Yerho, the interrelation between the levels of their elements. The fifth idea is that the interdependence of different levels of form is postulated as the general biological law of independence of features. The mutual neutrality of sound, style and image means, writes Yerho, that any plot can be realized in any verse, any stylistic figure may be combined with any conception, etc. However, these features can evolve jointly as well as separately, in clusters, he says. For Yerho, analysis does not exclude intuition. For him, as well as for his main opponent Gustav Speth, science is not a special way of cognition, but a special way of exposition. You can get an idea in any way, but you have to express it systematically and in a scientific way. All right. So the last idea is that the precondition for the application of statistics is an accurate philological analysis of the text structure. On the other hand, only those parameters are suitable for critical interpretation which were obtained as a result of an objective statistical examination. Beg your pardon. Yerho says that no statistic can be introduced without a morphological analysis, that is, examination of the real literary phenomena that it reflects. End of quotation. On the way to methodology, Yerho wrote two other works which are also included in the 2006 edition. The logic of research is as follows. If different formal levels are independent from one another, their proportion in different works of art will be different. The history of a genre can be described as an evolution of its different features and feature clusters. The differences between literary trends can be described as different proportions of particular features and groups of features. The poetics of a genre was studied in Yerho's monograph, The Comedies and Tragedies of Corneille. The aim of this study is to reveal the formal differences between different genres in the work of the same author. There are hundreds of plays which stay in between a typical tragedy and a typical comedy, and it is interesting to measure how they gravitate to one of these genres. Following Yerho, Shapiro, in his study of Griboyedov's War from Wheat, published in 1992, used precise calculation and demonstrated the tragicomic nature of Griboyedov's play. From the standpoint of many parameters, War from Wheat is midway between a comedy and a tragedy. The poetics of literary styles was studied in Yerho's monograph, Distribution of Speech in the Five-Act Tragedy. The aim of this work is to reveal the formal differences between the realizations of the same genre in the era of different authors, and to use this data in order to establish and to distinguish between literary trends. A genre is an optional combination of elements taken in a certain proportion. However, in the genre evolution, the genre features can evolve either independently or in clusters. Yerho planned his studies in such a way as to try his methodology in all the four ambits of literary studies. In phonics, he pioneered the study of the metrics of Russian poets. In 1934, Yerho with his colleagues published a metrical index, Metrический справочник, to Pushkin's poetry. This approach was later fully developed by the Russian scholars of verse. Today we need to add more descriptive parameters and create unified metrical databases and develop automated verse meter recognition. In stylistic, a pilot study was Yerho's analysis of tropes and figures in La Chanson de Roland. A wider scope of both traditional and original methods was used in Shapiro's study of the verse, language and style of the 19th century poet Gavril Batinkoff. Shapiro demonstrated that some half of Batinkoff's body of texts is very likely to be the most skillful Russian literary hoax of the second half of the 20th century, fabricated by our contemporary, the poet and philologist Alexander Ilyushin, a poet and professor of Russian literature at Moscow State University. In poetics, Yarho's calculation of the ideological elements in Le Chanson de Roland can serve as an example of the statistical approach. He compared Le Chanson with its clerical reworking and proved that it was composed in the military rather than clerical milieu. It is not easy to use statistics in this field. Nevertheless, there are some interesting findings. The Italian Russianist Guido Carpi has published an article titled "I'd Kill for Some Money, the Themes of Money and Aggression in the Brothers Karamazov, an Exercise in Statistical Analysis." Using Yarho's approach, Carpi demonstrates that these themes, money and aggression, correlate through the entire text of Dostoevsky's novel, and sometimes their correlation is far from being trivial. Thus, in the case of Dmitry Karamazov, we always find a statistically significant correlation between the theme of aggression in one chapter and the theme of money in the following chapter. This character's greed for money is not the reason for his destructive tendencies, but their consequences. We can see that Yarho's methods are time-consuming, and this was one of the objections against his methods in the Soviet times. But now, with the advent of digital humanities, many tasks are easier to achieve. And serious expectations are now attached to the works of the Stanford Literary Lab. Unfortunately, they are not widely known in Russia, where very few works of Franco Moretti, for instance, have been translated. In the early mentioned article, The Main Trends of 20th Century Criticism, René Velik maintained that Petrograd formalists were positivists with a scientific ideal of literary scholarship. This characteristic sounds like a description of Yarho rather than the Opayaz members. In 1969, Yuri Lotman was the first to give Gasparov a possibility to publish Yarho in Science System Studies. 2 years earlier, in 1967, Lotman published the article "The Study of Literature Must Be an Exact Science" in the Russian journal Vопросы литературы, and the article "Exact Methods in Soviet Literary Studies" in the Italian periodical Strumenti Critici. Lotman wrote about quantification of literary studies and, developing the insights of the Moscow formalists and the Prague structuralists, connected the new methodological turn with the orientation towards exact sciences, and within the humanities with the orientation towards linguistics. So, speaking of Russian formalism, we should not forget about two Moscow scholars, which will conclude my talk today: Vinokur and Brick. Vinokur was the first secretary to the Moscow Linguistic Circle and its penultimate president. Among the ideas introduced by Vinokur, the idea of philology as a special discipline and a moment in any humanitarian research should be mentioned. While Jan Baudouin de Courtenay, whose insights influenced the Moscow formalists even more than Saussure's, thought that linguistics may become productive in the nearest future only if it breaks the compulsory union with philology and history of literature. These are Baudouin de Courtenay's words. Vinokur, and especially late Vinokur in the 1940s, conceived of the synthesis of linguistics and history of literature on the basis of philology. A philologist is a scholar who does not analyze sense outside its linguistic expression, and vice versa, who regards language as a manifestation of culture. This idea goes back to August Burke and Hermann Usener via Konigsberg's unpublished article, The Concepts of Philology and Poetics. Konigsberg's and Vinokur's approach engendered the definition of philology as a discipline with its specific object and aim, understanding of the addressed text, and the definition of the role of philology as the foundation of humanitarian knowledge in general. This approach enables us to specify philology as the study of text and its sense, as opposed to linguistics, the study of language, semiotics, the study of science, history of literature, the study of the genesis of poetic forms, historical poetics, evolution of poetic forms, and theoretical poetics, typology of poetic forms. So, as early as in 1925, in his article The Theory of Formal Method, Eichenbaum explained Characteristically enough, the formalists didn't orient, as literary students usually had, toward cultural or social history, psychology, or aesthetics, and so on, but toward linguistics, a science bordering on poetics and sharing material with it, but approaching it from a different perspective and with different problems. Welek categorized Russian formalism as a linguistic trend of 20th century criticism, but this characteristic seems to be more adequate if applied to Vinokur, Jakobson and Yerho rather than Apayaz. Indeed, as Petr Grzybik pointed out, I don't have this quotation here. Despite this common linguistic basis, Apayaz and the Moscow Linguistic Circle developed different approaches, whereas the MLC was more linguistically oriented. For Apayaz, linguistics was merely a related and helpful discipline from which methodological innovations in the study of literature could be gained. End of quote. Even in the 1960s, in his celebrated paper, Linguistics and Poetics, Jakobson wrote, "Since linguistics is the global science of verbal structure, poetics may be regarded as an integral part of linguistics." In the same paper, Jakobson writes of poetics as a branch of linguistics and linguistics as a branch of general semiotics. This position goes back to Saussure. Although in the 1920s the dichotomy of structural linguistic and semiotic approaches led to the collapse of the MLC, in his later work Jakobson synthesized these two approaches. In 1934, Jan Mukarzhowski spoke to the International Congress of Philosophers in Prague and presented a paper, Art as a Semiological Fact, in which he proposed the concept of semiotics as general aesthetics. The next year, Jakobson started to combine the linguistic approach with the semiotic approach, as if he wanted to solve the contradictions between the antagonistic methodologies within the Moscow Linguistic Circle. In his lecture course on Russian formalism, delivered in Czech in 1935, Jakobson maintained, during the first years of the existence of the formal school, ardent debates took place over whether the problem of poetry can be reduced to a linguistic problem. That is, do we have a right to reduce the scholarly problem of poetry to the problem of language in its aesthetic function? In the poetic form, there are elements which do not contain anything specifically linguistic, but represent a semiological problem. Thus, an internal understanding of the sign helps to include poetics in semiology, the study of signs. End of quotation. Osip Brik, as well as Jakobson, was an active member of both Apayaz and the MLC. He formulated several innovative ideas which were later developed by other scholars. His role can be compared with the role of Shklovsky from this point of view. I would like to highlight two such ideas and finish this paper, this talk. Brick's paper on the rhythmico-syntactic figures, which is cited at the very beginning of Eichenbaum's 1922 book, was delivered at an Apayaz meeting in 1920. A year before, on the 1st of June 1919, Brick gave a provisional report on this topic to the MLC under the title On the Verse Rhythm. And in June 1919, the MLC discussed Sergei Bobrov's paper, which was published in 1922 as Borings and Influences. Then Brick started, but never finished, his monograph Rhythm and Syntax, several excerpts from which were published in Novolev in 1927. The groundbreaking works of Brick and Bobrov raised the question of how meter and rhythm are bound up with vocabulary and grammar. Gasparov later called this field the linguistics of verse. Together with poetics, vocabulary and phraseology, it is an integral constituent of poetic language, and its study is one of the most important tasks in the field of linguistics poetics, and now is facilitated by the appearance and development of linguistic corpora. The second idea was expressed during the debates on his own paper on the verse rhythm. Brick raised the question of the semiotics of meter and demonstrated the connection between the Russian trochaic pentameter with the theme of going the one way, тема пути, Лермонтов, выхожу один я на дорогу, Тютчев's, вот бреду я вдоль большой дороги, and so on. Brick's examples were later used by Roman Jakobson in 1938 and Kirill Taranovsky in 1963. So usually students of Russian literature associate these ideas and these examples with Taranovsky, although Brick cited them in 1919. A wide scope of investigations in this area was undertaken by Mikhail Lotman, Mikhail Gasparov and Michael Wachtel. Thus the foundations were laid for a new field in the history and theory of verse. So to conclude, the Russian formal school did not possess international methodological unity and did not manage to create a new scientific paradigm in Thomas Kuhn's sense of this word. Thus, from the Kuhnian standpoint, formalism, as Peter Steiner pointed out, can be termed as an interparadigmatic stage in the evolution of Slavic literary scholarship. A formation of the new scientific paradigm, according to Steiner, was accomplished by the Prague Linguistic Circle in the mid-1930s, when the PLC leaders Jakobson and Mokrzewski proposed a program of integration of structural linguistics and semiotic methods for the study of languages, literature, and cultures. But in the history of knowledge, periods of nomothetic development or normal science, as Kuhn calls it, are opposed to the scientific revolutions which generate new epistemological paradigms. And the formalist breakthrough of 1920s and 1920s can be precisely called such a revolution. There is a period of grand shift, and our reconsideration of this revolution may lead to a new epistemological revolution in the humanities. Thank you for attention.
Okay, questions? How would you like to take one by one or a number of questions at the same time?
Well, I think one by one will be easier to answer.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for your talk. There are many questions. In fact, I'll just ask one. This obviously has a great heuristic value for what scholars are doing today. And the question is, in your opinion, what are the underpinnings, the scientific presuppositions of such research today compared to what they were then? And we know what quantitative methods can help us study, but are there such areas which you do not know how to study yet using quantitative methods? Thank you.
Right, thank you for this question. First of all, there was an idea that the quantitative methods were exhausted after the 1960s. But now I can feel that the general impression is different. But we cannot use the same presuppositions and the same philosophical grounds as, for instance, Yarho did, because we think and live, for instance, after the post-structuralist critique and criticism of structuralism and formalism. And at the same time, we are aware of the problems which our predecessors were not fully aware of. For instance, the formalists like Yarho never tried to combine the study of purely literary elements with the study of elements of other related serious, and we can see that there can be found interesting correlations between series, as Jakobson and Tynyanov predicted. So if we study the sociology of literature and sociology of literary studies, we can apply things like network analysis to various authors, and we can use, and we use actually, we do use statistical methods there. This was outside the ambit of Yarho's project. Another interesting thing that we know more about different spheres than the scholars in the 1930s. Well, I'm interested in verse theory and verse studies, and we can see that there are lots of things which we can do using statistical method, which is called actually the Russian method as applied to verse studies. But for instance, the formalists thought that the syllabatonic verse, which replaced syllabic verse in Russian culture, will be replaced by the tonic verses, because it was the main system of versification for the futurists, for Mayakovsky, the greatest poet of the decade, and they believed that tonics will win. Actually, what happened, happened that the Acmists won, and Brodsky followed Acme's, and the main system of versification became the Acme's dolnik, and not the futurist tonic verse. But the dolnik posed lots and lots of problems connected with the non-classical Russian verse, and the dolnik problems can be actually described only using the corpora the corpus and statistical methods, because there is no actual border between dolnik and non-dolnik. So we have to use statistical methods here, but we can add new methods, which are corpora methods. We can study the same phenomenon using different text corpora, and the definition of, for instance, in my example of dolnik, will be different depending on the corpus of text. For instance, the dolnik of Tsvetaeva will be 1 meter, non-classical meter. The dolnik of different poets from the 1921 to 1923 will be another type of dolnik, and it's a really important characteristic. This is something that neither Yarho nor other scholars of formalism thought of. They did not work with a corpus. They tried to work with a representative group of text only. Well, but, that's not everything, of course, but only a few points. So was it the answer to your question?
Yes, so we're back, you could say, to what scholars like Arne were doing in the 19th century, just collecting the material, and now we can really quantify it.
And that's true, because, then again, the formalist structuralist answer to Arne was Prop. And Prop says that it's not important which elements occupy these particular fields and play this particular function. Functions are more important for this approach than the elements which are occupied. But again, the Stanford studies show that we can calculate them and have important and significant conclusions, especially when we speak about big masses of text, but not only big masses.
Since you mentioned Brodsky, who was a friend of Tomaszewski and spent some time in his house, and I'm looking for the answer, which is not exactly within your frame of lecture, but maybe you can answer that. Where did he get the idea of language knows itself, language finds itself, language is older than authority, all these kind of complex of ideas that he almost obsessively presented in his essays?
Right. Well, I think that Brodsky can be considered as, let's say, the English metaphysical tradition grafted to the post-Acmeist poetics, and actually the formalist poetics was closely connected not only with futurism as in Epoeas, but also with the Acmeists, as in the Moscow Linguistic Circle. They, for them, for instance, Kuzmin was as important a poet as Mayakovsky, which is more or less obvious today, but was not obvious for many students of Russian literature before. So I would say that this idea in Brodsky goes back to T.S. Eliot's reinterpretation of metaphysical tradition, and Eliot's idea of the dominance of language for the poet. But at the same time, it correlates very well with the formalist ideas, including Jacobson's famous formulation of poetry as a violence against language. If poetry deforms, if poetry deforms language, then at first sight this is an opposite idea, then poetry is more important than language. But actually poetry deforms practical language, which is not the language from the capital L, and the language from the capital is poetic language. So the poetic language is the language the poet is trying either to construct, and this is a constructivist approach which we can find in Shklovsky and other thinkers, but at the same time we can say that the poet is trying to grasp the existing poetic language. This is the point where these two ideas, which are seemingly contradictory, well, they can be combined. And Trotsky wasn't afraid of contradiction, was he? Yeah?
Thank you for your talk. So you have, in the juxtaposition that you have here showed between APIAS and MLC, I see a tendency in the MLC of institutionalization, of course, whereas APIAS and academic, but as a result, or maybe it's not causally related, I don't know, there is continuous compartmentalization, kind of the demarcation, this belongs to linguistics, this belongs to semiotics, to narrower and narrower spheres that don't necessarily interact with each other. And this is perhaps one of the effects of making literary studies scientific, in the sense of modeling it on the science of linguistics. Whereas the same statement in APIAS, making the literary studies scientific, entails, as you said, methodological innovation, which also I think, or this is the question, does it imply that it is a completely different understanding of what science is? So one models on science, the other reinterprets what science is. And so I wonder what are the repercussions of this? Would you relate this to kind of APIAS openness to different series? To the political series, to perpetual clashes with the literary series, where they once in a while, on many occasions, affirm that literary studies should be a literary genre and a science at the same time. And does this imply MLC's closure towards the political, or is there any notion of the political in MLC, in this compartmentalization?
Right, yeah, it is a good question actually, because first of all, the formalist poetics. So is it a method or is it a new discipline? Because we remember that Eichenbaum called the formalist method well, morphological method, but pointed out that it is a method, right? And it is a method, not a dogma, therefore it develops and it can include new ideas and new spheres. But at the same time, very fine critic of formalism, Boris Engelgard, described APIAS formalism as the creation of new discipline using different methods which are not necessarily related to each other. And poetics became or theory of literature, the idea of theory of literature introduced by APIAS not only in the Russian humanities but worldwide, and the equation of poetics and theory of literature, because the title of Tomaszewski's textbook, the first textbook, APIAS textbook on poetics, was Poetica, and in brackets, Теория литературы, so it's the same. We can say that the development of formalism is the development of poetics. The idea that poetics can be discipline which includes other disciplines, and this story began much earlier than formalism came to existence. I mean, the relationship between poetics and rhetorics in European culture. So, and with the advent of linguistics and stylistics, we've got three disciplines: rhetorics, stylistics, and poetics, which tend to cover the entire field and include two others in them. So it actually led to the well, blurring of boundaries of poetics. And what Apayas wanted to do was to apply the methods of poetics to non-literary texts. And they would say to non-text, but with semiotic approach we can say that all other things are also texts. So this is one point. And for the MLC, even the positivist or the empiric wing of the MLC, which was, they called themselves the Apayas in the MLC, right, as opposed to Spetians. But even for them, it was important to break the entire field into disciplines and then to go up and combine disciplines so that they help each other. For instance, this is how Vinocourt formulates the problem of philology. It uses different methods and the results of different other disciplines, history, archaeology, whatever, and is an encyclopedia of sciences. But then it is a momentum per se, which is find itself not only in interpreting literary texts, but in interpreting any addressed and historically distant text. For instance, the history of mathematics is also philology for Vinocourt. So you cannot say from this point of view that the disciplines of this philological cycle, as Vinocourt would call it, they are not connected to each other. You cannot say that because of the fact that semiotics and linguistics and philology are defined as different disciplines, that is, these spheres of knowledge which have its precise and separate object, method and aim, they cannot support each other. And the last interesting aspect of this problem is the idea of the discipline which embraces all other disciplines, so becomes a kind of junction or I don't know, a bridge between them. For the literary studies of the 19th century, such discipline was philosophical aesthetics. And the philosophical aesthetics of the late 19th and early 20th century was based on psychology, hence the importance of psychology, right? So the formalists did not like this idea. They tried to oppose poetics to general aesthetics, and we can see that Jakobson calls the aesthetic function the poetic function, because the definition of the aesthetic function in Mukarzhowski and the definition of the poetic function in Jakobson is exactly the same. But Jakobson simply hated the word aesthetic and did not use it. At the same time, as I tried to demonstrate, they very soon realized that there are many non-linguistic elements in what we can study with formalist methods. We cannot study intersemiotic objects like how to stage a play or how to film a novel, or how to make a statue out of a poem using only linguistic methods. So we needed new science, new discipline which would unify different disciplines, sub-disciplines, or make up a cycle, and would not be a philosophical aesthetic. And the structuralist answer was semiotics. Right? We usually link the idea of structural and semiotic methods with the 1960s or 1950s, but in fact they go back to the 30s and the 20s. So I would say that the development of this particular approach today led to the replacement of semiotics by cultural semiotics and cultural semiotics by cultural anthropology, which can use the methods and compare the linguistic data, the genetic data, the archaeological and paleoarchaeological data, and so on. So this idea of the unifying discipline, which would replace philosophy with its aesthetics in the same way as philosophy in its turn replaced theology earlier. Well, was it the answer?
Igor, thank you very much for this talk. Very, very interesting and fascinating. I have, if I may, two questions. One has to do with the use of literary evolution and this reference to Darwin and genetics and mutation. This was a pervasive discourse in the 1920s up until Vladimir Prop and morphology Skorsky, and you have this distinction between morphology versus mutation that he also talks about with reference to Skorsky and Tallinn. Did Yerho and the other Moscow members, I was going to say something else, members of the circle, did they implement this idea of genetics mutation in their works? You cited, I think, Yerho with reference to mutation and biological evolution. We know that Shklovsky and Tenyanov tried to do this, and as I've argued, Shklovsky did this very consistently in very interesting ways. But did Yerho sort of consistently try to work with this idea of evolution, and does that sort of separate him from what Tenyanov and Shklovsky did based on Ferdinand Brunetière and slightly different sort of genealogy or stuff? And my other question is, how would you contextualize the work of MLK vis-a-vis work that's being done by the Stanford Humanities lab today? In other words, they're similar, the same, exactly the same. What do the MLK research bring to this work by Moretti and Moretti students, and how do you see them interact as a sort of future of the humanities overall?
Right, yeah, I think it's очень своевременный вопрос. Right, there will be a conference in Stanford, well, in a week, actually devoted to formalism and digital humanities. And as far as I know, Peter Steiner is going to speak about these correlations. But he links it not only with the Moscow and Petrograd formalists, but further back with Veselovsky. Speaking back to your first question of the biological metaphors in formalists, in Yerho it's more than a metaphor, and in the methodology of this exact literaturovedения, there are lots and lots of parallels between literature and biological forms, much more than in Shklovsky or Tenyanov. Including genetics, including statistics in genetics, because Yerho was a professional statistician when he didn't have a job, and it happened very often. He worked as a statistician in, well, I can't remember where, something like Gosplan. And from this point of view, he was much more professional than others. At the same time, what is important now? There are lots and lots of insights in Yerho about how we can, what we can count and what we cannot. But his biology is outdated today, and his statistics is also outdated today. I mean, there are developments. Well, there are some statistical procedures which he uses, and mathematicians will say, well, it's okay for the beginning of the 20th century, but not now, after the developments in the use of statistics as applied to poetic texts with the work of Kolmogorov, one of the greatest mathematicians. well, we can modify that. So first of all, we can use Yarho's insights, and we can use more modern, more contemporary mathematical and statistical methods. It's number one. Then many parallels between biology and literature in Yarho. They sometimes look not very convincing, and sometimes look very convincing. But our ideas of biology, of evolution, and of genetics also have changed since then. And maybe these parallels may be more useful today if we reconsider them. If we've got a more updated view of both literature and biology. And the third element is digital humanities, meaning both large corpora of texts and the tools to analyze them. So something which Yarho did not consider because many things were too tiresome, too time-consuming at those times, and we can use them now, for instance, in the analysis of syntax or in the analysis of parallel corpora. Nobody would, would try to develop an algorithm of comparing two syntactic structures which consist of 10,000 elements, because it was unnecessary, simply a mind game. But today with the computer, well, you can do this. Why not? And there is a big field. At the same time, I would feel that a translation of at least some bits of Yarho into English would be very useful, because the only we've got the short synopsis of Yarho in English, like Hugo Margolin's, and it's similar to Gasparov's synopsis. It's very insightful, but it doesn't feed you with details. So if you are interested in details, then the portions of this huge book should be translated. Some portions are translated into Italian, but then again, not all the necessary details. Maybe a complete translation would be an interesting thing, but I can't think of anyone who would be not interested, but devote and dedicate him and herself to such a huge task.
Then also ask Michael.
Yeah,
Please go.
I had a question about your conclusion, which is, and thank you again also for such a fascinating talk. But I was wondering about the conclusion, whether the account of formalism and its or the lack of a paradigmatic shift only works if you see sort of quantification as the telos towards which all literary studies should head. And I ask only because I'm just not sure, sort of right now, whether quantification is the dominant, just to use one of their terms. And so I guess I sort of wonder if it's quantification that then becomes re-inscribed into a kind of story of the dynamism of form, or the kind of ощущение formy, like is it going to be employed towards other formalist methods or formalist concerns, or does one sort of jettison those other aspects of formalism, namely kind of the perception of form, the kind of concept of history and the philosophy of history that you can glean from them. So I just wasn't sure if what happens to your account if you strip away the kind of this sort of seeming necessity of quantification, and instead, I don't know, highlight other aspects of formalism, or if the account is to say formalism really should have gone towards a much more rigorous form of quantification and sort of not bothered with the other things.
Yeah, good question. Thank you. Well, I would say that that quantification was dominant only for Yarho, not for other formalists, first of all, and the opposition between quantification and non-quantification, which was important for Yerho, who despised Tunyanov, in fact, and Eichenbaum despised Yerho. At the same time, Tomaszewski was on good terms with all the three, and it shows that his approach promises well, what I envisage as the future of this post-formalist paradigm, because well, this paradigmatization of formalism in structuralism is only one of possible paradigmatizations, and by reconsidering the unrealized and understudied aspects, we can find a new paradigm, because we go another way. And I am sure that many insights of Tunyanov and Yerho can be combined. For instance, the question of the dominant. Yerho's point was that he demonstrated that the dominant can be quantifiable, and this is his particular insight and impact. But at the same time, the dominant is what is better or more accurately perceived. Well, he agrees with Shklovsky's ощутимость формы, but we can see that what is ощутимо, what is perceived, is either higher in numbers, or lower in numbers, or the same in numbers but unusually structured. And Yerho himself understands that there are three aspects of the dominant, not only two types of qualitative dominant, too much or too many, and too few or too less, but also structured in a different way. This is the point where we can combine both approaches, and these are the ways how to combine them. Actually, we can measure the differences between structures. This is something Tunyanov didn't think of. For him, the new structure is more efficient, but Yerho's question was насколько, how much? But we can measure that, because we can measure the distance between phonemes, for instance, or we can measure different distances between meters, which is important for instance, meter recognition and building maps of phonetics and so on and so on. So what they have themselves interpreted as contradictory can undergo a kind of Hegelian Aufhebung and may be productive.
I have a question. Yes.
I think that.
Well, sorry, I already asked.
Vice, no, you go.
I just wanted to ask this. The methods are fascinating, but there's always the problem of which to choose. And the Petersburg formalists had their theory of literary evolution. And I wanted to ask to what extent, in your opinion, some of the Moscow formalists relied on it. And do you view the idea of the literary fact as a challenge to the entire idea of qualitative poetics?
To qualitative or quantitative?
Quantitative, yes.
Well, because
Of course you don't know what to count, because today this is one text, tomorrow it may be something else.
Well, that's right, yeah, but I would say that we can take it into account and count. The idea was that you have to analyze an object before you try to quantify it. Yerho thought that it should be applied to verbal constructions, because their borders are more or less obvious. Actually, they are not. And the literary fact points out, the idea of literary fact points out that there are different elements which are important in this context and are not important in that context. And there is no constant border between text and non-text. Well, if you start thinking about poetry, contemporary poetry, you can see that many poets include their living voice in their presentation, and you cannot think of Brigov's poetry without his particular voice, but actually you cannot think properly about Vysotski's poetry without his particular voice. Can we add these parameters to the quantified analysis of text? Why not? We don't have to lean on the purely linguistic presupposition, and actually they did not want to speak only of those things which could be described by purely linguistic methods. When Vinogradov and Yerho and other formalists and neo-formalists speak of the composition as the linguistic level, this is already suspicious, because with those linguistic methods they had at hand, could not properly describe composition. If you cannot do that, why can you describe anything else? But you need to. So you have to enlarge the field and add other series to the literary series. And poetic fact is the result of an analysis which shows that this and that series are important for the literary series at this particular moment, and we cannot consider this text as an artistic text for this particular period without considering these elements, and we can disregard other elements because are less important. So I would not say that the qualitative approach is a contraposition or an opposition to quantitative approach. They actually need each other, and any qualitative critique of quantitative approach is useful for self-conscious quantitative approach. So that's what I would think of that. Well, the ideas of Eichenbaum and Tynyanov in the late 1912, they destroyed the early formalist presupposition of the autonomy of text, but they did not destroy anything else, and they only helped to build the concept of evolution, because if literary evolution cannot be properly described as an intrinsic autonomous evolution, then we need other series. But who says that we cannot quantify them? If we can quantify that, this. So after quantify this, it goes quantify that.
Yes, please.
Please, no problem. I wanted to ask a little bit about your work on FebWeb and RBB, and just to see if some of the decisions you've made as editor in that sort of the accessibility, the platform, the user interface, is it all influenced by some of these ideas of quantifiable, quantitative literary studies, some of the ideas of Yerho you've been talking about, or if it comes from sort of a more contemporary notion of what is useful in the digital humanities? Just curious if you could say a few more words about that.
Right. Well, actually, not only Yerho, but Vinokurov, his idea of philology was very important for the construction of FebWeb. For instance, the idea that the text is plunged into its original milieu. We reproduce the edition, not just a text. The edition is identified bibliographically and related with the its printed source. The composition of the digital scholarly edition reflects the most general structures of our vision of this field of study, so that we can we can go from the textbooks to the structure of FebWeb. So these are not the ideas of quantification, but rather the ideas of philology, which is the work with the individual text, and this favoring individual texts, understanding that different editions of Eugen and Onegin are different texts, and many of them are worth of reproducing in the same corpus, is a very philological idea, and the idea which is not favored by linguists who think that there is only one Shakespeare, only one Pushkin, right, and the text is always the same. And I'm not joking, because I know several prominent linguists who told me, thank you for your telling me about editorial theory. We suppose that all texts are identical. At the same time, the idea that we can count more than we can count today, so there are more things which can be useful for quantitative analysis, is implied in the RVB markup. If you open the actual markup in FEB, it's very functional, so it only supports those functions which are included in the present version of FEBWeb, although the originals of these marked up documents are, are more profound. I mean, the HTMLs which you see on the side are not the files that we produce in the process of digitalization. These are the output files only. And it's more obvious with RVB. If you open the markup, you will see that there are lots of identified elements there. Identified lines, the number, identified paragraphs, number of paragraphs, number of lines. And we want to introduce more, even if we do not use them now. But if we introduce something, for instance, we introduced the metrical indexes on RVB, and we used the previously made markup to do this automatically, and then edit it rather than do it manually. So I would say that this idea that if we analyze something and we find that there are elements which can be counted, even if we don't know now what to do with them, we can leave it for the future, and this future may be a nearest future. For instance, the collection of the 18th century poets on RVB, which was the first electronic collection of Russian 18th century poets, was used in the national corpus of the Russian language and based the poetic subcorpora of the national corpus. This is why you've got more 18th century poets there than 19th century poets. And they could make use of some of the markup which was already there and add their own markup. But I cannot say that all my ideas in philology, textology, literary theory and verse theory are realized in these two libraries, because some problems require a corpus-based approach, other philological-based approach, and there are problems which are not covered by available tools and need the creation and development of new tools. So they are not perfect from this to me.
Can I ask a question also that maybe has a couple of layers to it? I guess I was thinking about the prominence of the concept of the mistake in Apayas. And the sort of the really important part it plays in their notion of literary evolution, and as that led me to sort of wonder about the relationship, which again is very important for Apayas, between system and event, right, or between a kind of status quo literature, right, and breakthrough moment in literature, and this of course kind of mirroring their own position, as you pointed out, is in inter-paradigmatic science. And I guess I was wondering, statistical noise, right? We're deciding what is noise, right, and what is not noise, and the relationship between the noise and the kind of productive error, right? Has there been an attempt to conceptualize the notion of vypadania as a, I mean, it may be altogether not useful, but again, I think in line with some of the previous questions about how we can integrate other important categories from the formalist corpus into this quantification. In other words, does quantification tend to produce pictures of systems, right, without allowing us to take stock of what is in fact the engine of evolution from some point of view, or from the point of view of some of the formalist models. And that link connects to the other question about distant and close reading, right? So the idea of distant reading, which is so prominent again in Stanford, which is linked to the pathos of look, we have massive amounts of texts now, right? And now for the first time we can read it without actually reading it, right? In other words, we have tools for analysis without reading, right? Which is a kind of powerful paradigmatic shift in a way. You seem to have, in the case of some of the examples that you gave from your course work, you seem to have statistical analysis of either single texts or corpuses of one author, as opposed to the kind of stuff that Stanford is doing with 23,000 Victorian, British Victorian novels, right? So I guess these two questions, how to understand statistical close reading, is there such thing as statistical close reading, and whether or not that may be more promising for some kind of a notion of understanding the relationship between statistical meaningfulness and statistical noise.
That's right, yeah. Well, the idea of distant reading is again opposed to close reading, but the Jacobian approach would state that close reading is only possible against the background of the distant reading, but it does not exclude close reading at all, because what we can say about a peculiarity of a particular text is the statement of peculiarity only if we compare it with other texts. Then the more texts, the better, and then we need distant reading. But which text? We cannot compare every text with everything else. So there is a problem of representativeness of any corpus, whatever large the corpus is. And not all the objects are as obvious as, for instance, the novel. Although the novel doesn't have its proper borders, but you can say that, for instance, this is not a novel, and many other things like this. But you cannot say, if I write a poem, that I say this is a taktevik, and you say no, it's not a taktevik. And even if you have 10 experts in non-classical Russian poetry, you can have maybe 10 or 11 views of is it taktevik or not. We need an interpretation of the material before we calculate and after we calculate. Both before and after are close readings. The close reading of representative texts to extrapolate the idea of a new object. So, well, say the Victorian novel. To have an idea of Victorian novel, we cannot simply collect all the Victorian novel. We have to get an idea of Victorian novel. We have to read different authors. These authors are similar. Maybe they are similar because they are Victorian authors. And then try to check this, because maybe they are similar for a completely different reason. Right? And then at the end, when we've got the results, we can see that some authors, they are out of the main system, and it's interesting why they are out. But now we know that they are out because of the distant reading, and our close reading of this peculiarity is supported by a distant reading. So I would say that these are two aspects of one and the same type of humanitarian cognition, and they can be opposed to each other as heuristic methodological steps. But you cannot say that you describe different objects by using these different methods. All right. So the objects are compatible although they don't coincide from the very beginning. I mean, a typical novel of any type, right, is not properly realized in any particular novel. There may be a situation when a typical structure is not fully realized in any text at all, or only in one text, which you would not consider the most representative text. For instance, when Yuri Levin analyzed the invariable plot of Tyutchev using the method of prop, he described a typical Tyutchevian plot, and he demonstrated that it is realized in every poem, but not all the elements. But all the order of function is the same, and there are the established number of functions. And the only text which includes all of them is the text, the poem called Problesk of 1825. It's a very good text, but it's not the most well-known text. At the same time, it's in a sense a very Tyutchevian text, because what is Tyutchevian? There are different editions of Tyutchev with different textology, different editorial decisions. Most of them are chronological, and there is only one decision, which is an academic edition produced by Pigarev, who was the descendant of Tyutchev and felt closeness to his ancestor. So he published Tyutchev in the Literary Monument series and divided it into two volumes. The first volume contains the poetry which Pigarev liked, and the second volume the poems which he did not like. Right? For the rest, it's chronological. So the first poem of the first volume of Pigarev's edition is Problesk. So we can see that intuition and quantification can coincide, and at the same time you cannot say that this is the most it's the most representative poem of Tyutchev's plot. But if you ask the lover of Tyutchev, they will think of different poems which are their beloved poems. But there is something in this analysis as well. I mean, two different people came to the same decision.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for coming and for the discussion.